The Florida sun beat down on the manicured green, a relentless, brilliant eye in the vast blue sky. For Michael Jordan, these quiet afternoons on the golf course were a sanctuary, a world away from the roaring crowds and the relentless pressure that had defined most of his life. Here, it was just the satisfying thwack of a well-struck drive, the gentle rustle of palm fronds, and the easy silence between old friends. He was lining up a putt, the concentration etched on his face as it always was, whether for a championship, ring, or a $10 bet, when his assistant approached quietly. He held out a buzzing phone, his expression a mix of apology and intrigue. "It's for you, sir. It's Juanita." The name hung in the humid air, a ghost from a past life. 20 years. It had been 20 years since their divorce was finalized, since the headlines had screamed about the settlement and the end of a seemingly perfect dynasty. 2 decades of polite, distant co-parenting, of brief conversations at graduations, and weddings of a relationship pared down to its simplest, most functional form. Michael straightened up, the putt forgotten. He took the phone, the sleek, cool metal feeling suddenly heavy in his hand, a tangible link to a chapter he'd long since closed. "Juanita." His voice was calm, the familiar cadence masking a whirlwind of questions. "This is a surprise. Everything all right with the kids?" There was a pause on the other end, a breath held just a moment too long. "The kids are fine, Michael. Everyone's healthy. That's not why I'm calling." Her voice was older, of course, layered with the wisdom and wear of the years, but beneath it, he could still hear the woman he'd once known so intimately. She sounded nervous, and Juanita was never nervous. "Okay," he said slowly, walking away from the green towards a quieter spot under a sprawling banyan tree. "What's on your mind?" The conversation started like a hesitant dance, both of them stepping carefully around the edges of their shared history. They spoke of the humid Chicago summer, of a mutual friend's recent retirement, of the mundane details that serve as shields for something bigger. But the tension was there, a live wire humming beneath the pleasantries. Michael could feel it. He'd spent his life reading defenses, sensing shifts in momentum before anyone else. He knew this wasn't a social call. And then, the shift. The casual pretense fell away. Her voice dropped, becoming softer, more serious, laced with a gravity that made him stop walking altogether. "Michael, listen. There's a reason I called today. There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Another pause, this one heavier, filled with the weight of unsaid words. "Do you remember the promise I made to you back in 1991? Not long after we won the first one?" The question landed like a physical blow. 1991. The year everything changed. The year the climb to the summit finally ended. The year of champagne and parades and a new, unimaginable pressure. 1,000 promises were made in those dizzying days. But he knew instantly which one she meant. It was the one whispered in the dark, away from the microphones and the flashing lights, a desperate pact forged in the fire of sudden, overwhelming fame. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that belonged on a final possession, with seconds on the clock, not on a peaceful golf course. The world around him, the sun, the birds, the distant laughter from another fairway, seemed to fade into a dull hum. All that existed was the phone pressed to his ear and the ghost of a promise from 30 years ago. "Juanita," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "What is this about?" The memory didn't just appear, it engulfed him. The sterile, air-conditioned silence of his study dissolved, replaced by the thick, electric air of a Chicago autumn night in 1991. The scent of champagne and sweat still hung in the penthouse. Sweet, a sweet and sour testament to the victory celebration that had just ended. The roar of the city below was a distant, constant hum, a celebration that belonged to him, yet felt galaxies away from where he stood, alone on the balcony. The championship ring felt heavy on his finger, a golden shackle. Everyone saw the glory. No one saw the quiet terror that came with it. That was the night the fear truly took root. The night he realized winning wasn't the finish line. It was the starting gate of a much more terrifying race. And she was there. Juanita. She didn't find him with words. She simply appeared beside him, her presence a calm in the storm of his thoughts. She leaned against the railing, her shoulder just touching his, and followed his gaze out over the glittering, noisy city. She didn't say, "You should be happy." She didn't say, "This is what you wanted." She understood that the weight of a crown could bruise as much as it could glorify. Her silence was a language they both spoke fluently in those days, a quiet acknowledgement of the unspoken pressure, the relentless scrutiny that had begun to feel less like admiration and more like a siege. In that moment, she wasn't just his wife. She was his co-conspirator, the only other person in the world who could possibly understand the bizarre, gilded cage that victory had built around them. The challenges weren't the big, dramatic scandals the tabloids craved. They were 1,000 tiny cuts. It was the stranger who somehow got their home number, his voice a low, threatening slur in the middle of the night. It was the gifts that arrived in the mail that had to be scanned for needles or poison. It was the heartbreaking moment they had to explain to their oldest why they couldn't just go to the park like a normal family, why Daddy's face on a cereal box meant he couldn't be their secret playground superhero anymore. The fame built a wall of glass between them and the world. They could see out, everyone could see in, but true, simple touch was impossible. Their marriage became a fortress, and their love was the quiet, steadfast commitment to stand guard together. The personal struggles were hidden behind closed doors, the exhausting arguments born from frayed nerves and constant pressure, the lonely nights when his obsession with winning felt like a third person in their marriage, the silent fear that this life, for all its glitter, was slowly eroding the very thing they were trying to protect, their family. They were two people clinging to each other in the middle of a hurricane, and that promise he asked her to make was the rope that tied them together. It was a vow that within these walls, the world's noise would not enter. It was their shared hope that a secret, something pure and untouched by the madness, could be their anchor. It was the last piece of their life that belonged solely to them. That fortress we built, it had cracks. The world thinks it knows the story, the glamour, the victory, the iconic moments frozen in time. They don't know about the silence that could stretch for days, heavy and suffocating after a loss. It wasn't a silence of anger, but of a profound, gut-wrenching disappointment that would settle over him like a fog. He'd retreat into a place where I couldn't reach him, a place where the only language was the echo of a missed shot, the only sound the relentless critique in his own mind. I'd leave a plate of food outside his office door, and it would sit there, untouched, for hours. That was the sacrifice you didn't see, the sacrifice of partnership, of sharing a burden so immense it distorted the shape of our ordinary life. I sacrificed the right to have a bad day, because my bad day could never, ever weigh the same as his. My struggles felt small in the shadow of his colossal pursuit of greatness. And the trust, it wasn't about other women. It was more fragile than that. It was about trusting that the man who came home at night was still the man I married. And not the entity known as Air Jordan. The public scrutiny chipped away at him, piece by piece. Reporters would invent quotes, photographers would hide in bushes, and every person he met wanted something. It built a wall of skepticism around his heart. There were times I'd suggest a vacation, just us, and I'd see the calculation in his eyes, not about the time away from training, but about the logistics, the security, the sheer exhausting effort of being on even in a moment meant for rest. It made me hesitate to ask for anything. It made me question whether my want for a normal moment was a selfish burden. That's the hidden struggle no one tells you about. When the person you love most becomes the most famous man on the planet, you have to learn to share them with millions of strangers, and you have to quietly hope that when the cameras are off and the crowds are gone, there's enough of the man you fell in love with left over for you. The sacrifices were in the mundane, the stolen ordinary. We couldn't argue like a normal couple. A disagreement in a restaurant, a tense moment in public, it could be a headline by morning. So we learned to swallow our words, to hold our frustrations until we were behind soundproofed doors. We sacrificed spontaneity. A simple trip for ice cream required a security detail, a planned route, a level of coordination that drained all the joy out of the act. I sacrificed a part of my own identity, becoming Michael Jordan's wife first, and Juanita, a distant second. My accomplishments, my dreams, were always viewed through the lens of his fame. It was a choice, every day, to love him. A conscious, active choice to look past the icon and see the man who was just as scared, just as tired, and just as human as I was. We were two people trying desperately to protect a tiny, fragile flame of a normal life from a hurricane of fame. And that promise, that secret we held between us, sometimes it felt like it was the only thing that was truly, solely ours. Not the NBA's, not the public's. Ours. It was the anchor in the storm, the one thread that connected the two people. We were before the world descended to the people we had to become. The cracks didn't break us all at once. It was a slow, quiet erosion, like water wearing down stone. The misunderstandings didn't start with shouting matches. They began with silence. A comment I'd make about needing more help with the mode children would be met with a distant nod, his mind still on a last-second play from a game weeks ago. My unmet expectation for a partner present in our home would clash with his unmet expectation for a sanctuary free from more demands. We were speaking different languages, mine of family and connection, his of legacy and pressure. The very thing that made him great, that single-minded, obsessive focus, became the wedge driven into the heart of our marriage. I wasn't competing with another woman. I was competing with a ghost, with the idea of perfection he felt he had to live up to for everyone else. How do you fight a ghost? How do you argue with a legacy? The ego clashes were never about who was right or wrong. They were about survival. His ego was a suit of armor, necessary to withstand the constant barrage of criticism and expectation from the outside world. But that same armor made him impenetrable to me. He couldn't turn it off. A gentle suggestion from me about maybe spending a weekend away could be perceived as an attack on his routine, a threat to the meticulous control he needed to maintain his edge. He'd become defensive, and I'd feel shut out. My own ego, bruised. from years of being relegated to the background, would rise up in response. We weren't a husband and wife working through a problem anymore. We were two fortified positions, lobbing grievances across a no-man's land of our own creation. The love was still there, buried deep, but it was becoming harder and harder to reach through the layers of resentment and exhaustion. The breaking point wasn't one event. It was the accumulation of 1,000 small moments of loneliness. It was sitting alone at a charity gala, smiling for cameras while he was surrounded by a wall of admirers, and realizing I felt more alone in that crowded room than I ever had by myself. It was the hollow ache of watching other couples have a simple, uncomplicated argument in a grocery store and feeling a pang of envy for their normalcy. It was the devastating understanding that the promise we'd made, to keep our worlds sacred and separate, had, in the end, walled us off from each other. We had become the secret we were keeping. The final decision to divorce wasn't made in anger. It was made in a quiet, tear-filled conversation where the only thing left to say was that we were both too tired to keep fighting a battle we no longer knew how to win. We had sacrificed everything for the fortress, and in the end, we were its only two prisoners. Letting go was the most painful thing we ever did, but it was also the first honest step we'd taken toward freedom in years. We weren't divorcing because we hated each other. We were divorcing because we loved the people we used to be enough to stop destroying them. The silence on the line stretched, thin and tight as a wire. Michael could hear the faint, shaky rhythm of her breath, a telltale sign of the emotion she was wrestling to control. The polished surface of his desk, the framed photographs of his children, the entire carefully constructed present moment, it all felt like a diorama, a fragile scene about to be shattered by the words coming through the receiver. He was back in that kitchen, the ghost of that young, terrified man clinging to him. He could almost smell the coffee she always brewed too strong. "The promise," she began, her voice soft but clear, each word chosen with the care of someone, handling something precious and fragile. "You asked me to protect the one thing that was truly ours, to keep something just for us, away from the cameras, the lawyers, the everything." She took another steadying breath. "After the divorce, the lawyers, my lawyers, they pushed. You know how it was. They wanted everything. They wanted to pick apart every asset, every account, every last detail of our life together to make sure I got what they said I was entitled to." Michael's grip tightened on the phone. He remembered the brutal clinical process. It had felt less like a divorce and more like a corporate dissolution. "There was an account," she continued, her tone dropping, becoming even more confidential, as if the walls themselves might be listening. "A small one. One you'd set up that first year after the championship. You called it the Rainy Day Fund. You'd put a little in from your first big endorsements. You said it was for our family, for something real, not for the noise." She paused, and the significance of the moment hung between them, a 20-year-old secret finally breathing the open air. "My team found it. It wasn't hidden, not really, but it was under a corporate name they didn't recognize. They brought it to me. They said it was part of the marital assets, that we needed to declare it, to split it." The air left Michael's lungs. He remembered that account. It was a token, a symbolic gesture from a time when money still felt new and strange. He'd almost forgotten it existed. "Juanita?" he started, but she cut him off, her voice gaining a new strength, a fierce, protective edge. "I told them, no." The words were simple, absolute, and landed with the force of a revelation. I told them it wasn't a marital asset. I told them it was a private trust, separate. I looked every one of those suits in the eye, Michael, and I lied. I invoked clauses. I signed affidavits. I buried it so deep not even their best forensic accountants could find it. I kept the promise. The shock was a physical thing, a cold wave washing over him. In the midst of the most acrimonious, public, and financially draining period of their lives, when self-preservation was the only law, she had protected him. She had chosen to honor a decade-old vow made in a moment of vulnerability over a potential fortune. She had fought her own team, her own advisors, to keep a secret for him. "The money's still there," she whispered, the fierceness fading back into a vulnerable honesty. "It's been there, all this time. It's grown. It's yours. It always was. I'm telling you now because it's time. The promise was for the two of us, and I've been the only one holding it for 20 years. I need to let it go. I need you to know that some promises, even from a marriage that's over, are worth keeping." The emotional payoff wasn't in the money. It was in the staggering, humbling act of loyalty. It was the realization that through all the bitterness, the distance, the silence, she had held a tiny piece of their shared history sacred. She had kept the one play nobody else got to call. The word "no" escaped his lips, not as a denial, but as a soft, involuntary exhale. A puff of air punched from his lungs by the sheer weight of her confession. The meticulously organized world of his study, the sharp lines of the desk, the perfect alignment of pens, the silent monitors, seemed to tilt on its axis. Stunned wasn't the right word. Stunned was for a blindside hit on the court. This was a fundamental rewriting of his own history. For 20 years, the narrative of their divorce had been a simple, painful equation. A failure, a dissolution, an ending. It was a story he had accepted, filed away, and moved on from. But now she had handed him a hidden chapter, a paragraph of breathtaking loyalty written in the middle of their war, and it completely obliterated the ending he thought he knew. His mind, usually a chessboard of strategy and calculation, was a riot of disconnected images. He saw the grim faces of the lawyers across the conference table. He saw the stacks of financial documents, every line item a tiny fracture in their life together. He saw her, across that same table, her posture regal but her eyes tired, and he had interpreted her silence as coldness, her compliance as a desire to take everything she could. He had been so armored up, so prepared for a fight over assets and alimony, that he had completely missed the secret battle she was fighting on his behalf. The guilt was immediate and acute, a hot flush of shame. He had misread her. For 2 decades, he had carried a version of her in his head that was, he now saw, a caricature, the ex-wife from the headlines, and he had never once questioned its accuracy. His voice, when he found it, was rough, stripped of all its famous bravado. It was just a man's voice, humbled and cracked with emotion. "You did that?" he asked, the question hanging in the air between them, spanning the hundreds of miles of telephone wire. "All this time, you never said a word. You let me think." He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. She knew what he had thought. She had lived with the consequence of his misunderstanding for 20 years. The emotion that swelled in his chest wasn't about the money. It was about the profound, isolating loneliness of keeping a promise like that. She had shouldered that burden alone, through the bitterness of the divorce, through the quiet years of distance, protecting a piece of his past when he had given her every reason not to. The reflection was a piercing one. He had spent a lifetime building a legacy the whole world could see, but she had quietly preserved a piece of his honor that no one knew existed. In that moment, Michael Jordan, the man who had faced down every kind of pressure imaginable, felt a vulnerability so complete it was terrifying. And it was the most human he had felt in years. The initial shock began to recede, like a tide pulling back, but it left his internal landscape completely rearranged. The revelation was a stone dropped into the still pond of his present, and the ripples spread out, touching everything, changing the shape of his past and his future in widening circles. The first ripple was a profound, disorienting sense of gratitude, so deep it felt like a physical ache. It was followed immediately by a second, more painful ripple of regret, not for the end of their marriage, that had been inevitable, but for the story he had told himself about its end. He had framed it as a clean break, a business transaction gone sour. He had neatly packaged his memory of Juanita into the role of ex-wife, and in doing so, he had erased her complexity, her loyalty, and her incredible strength. He had simplified her to fit his own narrative of moving on, and the injustice of that now felt like a moral failure. The ripple spread to his understanding of himself. His entire identity was built on control, over the game, over his brand, over his narrative. He was the one who made the last shot. He was the one who dictated the terms. Yet here was the stark, humbling truth. For 20 years, a crucial part of his story, a testament to his own character from a younger self, had been entirely in someone else's hands, and she had protected it with more care than he might have himself. It forced a seismic shift in perspective. His legendary competitiveness, his infamous trash talk, his relentless drive, it had all been a performance on a public stage. But this was something else. This was about the private, quiet currency of integrity, and he realized, with a jolt, that she had just proven herself to be far richer in it than he was. The effect reached his present. He looked around his study, at the trophies and the accolades, the symbols of a life built on winning. They suddenly seemed noisier, less significant. The quiet, unseen act of loyalty she had just described felt more valuable than any championship ring. It redefined his entire value system. What was legacy, really? Was it the headlines and the highlight reels that everyone saw? Or was it the promises you kept and the integrity you preserved in the dark when no one was watching? She had given him a new lens through which to view his own life, and it was a painfully clarifying one. The ripple wasn't just moving through him, it was changing the course of his future. It demanded a response, not a financial one, but a human one. It demanded that he finally, after all this time, see her not as a character in his story, but as the author of her own. An author who had just rewritten his with a single stunning act of grace. The game had changed. The buzzer had sounded on the old score. A new one was about to begin. The silence that followed was no longer a void, but a space, vast and newly charged, filled with the echoes of a truth that had been 2 decades in the telling. Michael could feel the weight of the phone in his hand, no longer a cold, impersonal object, but a fragile, vital thread connecting him to a part of his history he had thought forever lost. The meticulously controlled rhythm of his breathing felt unfamiliar, almost foreign, as if his body itself was recalibrating to this new, unsettling reality. The carefully constructed walls around his heart, fortified over years of public scrutiny and private battles, hadn't been breached. They had been quietly, gracefully walked around. She hadn't forced her way back in. She had simply reminded him that a door, long thought sealed shut, had always remained unlocked from her side. This was no longer about the money. The financial value of the account was a meaningless abstraction, a number on a screen that held no power in the face of the profound human transaction that had just occurred. The real value, the staggering currency of her revelation, was trust. It was the undeniable proof that in the midst of the most acrimonious, self-serving process imaginable, a divorce fueled by teams of lawyers and advisors, all demanding their pound of flesh, she had chosen integrity over incentive. She had looked at a straightforward path to personal gain, and deliberately, consciously, chose a more difficult path of principle. She had protected a vulnerable piece of his past when he was at his most defenseless, when he was armored up and expecting an attack from all sides. She had safeguarded a promise made by a younger, more idealistic version of himself, a version the world had forgotten and he himself had left behind. In doing so, she hadn't just been loyal to him, she had been loyal to the man he once aspired to be. A cascade of forgotten moments now flooded his mind, each one reinterpreted through this new, clarifying lens. Her calm demeanor during the brutal depositions, which he had mistaken for coldness, now looked like immense strength. Her refusal to engage in public mudslinging, which he'd cynically attributed to good PR advice, now revealed itself as a profound dignity. Even the polite, distant civility of their interactions over the years now felt less like indifference and more like a silent respect for the history they shared, a history he now realized she understood in a way he never had. The narrative of their divorce, a story he had told himself for 20 years, crumbled away, exposing the flawed and selfish architecture beneath. He had been the protagonist in his own story. He saw now that he had been a supporting character in hers, a character she had chosen to protect long after the script had called for her to exit the stage. The humility of that realization was a quiet earthquake within him. The greatest defender he'd ever had wasn't on any basketball court. She was on the other end of this phone line, and she had just, with a few quiet sentences, defended his legacy from the one person who could have truly tarnished it, himself. The hum of the air conditioner returned, the world slowly seeping back into his awareness. But it was a different world now. The carefully curated artifacts of his success, the gleaming trophies, the framed jerseys immortalizing moments of supreme athleticism, seemed to watch him from the walls, their silent applause suddenly hollow. They represented a language of victory he had mastered, a language of points scored, records broken, and opponents dominated. But Juanita had just spoken another language entirely, one of quiet fidelity and unshakable character, and he found himself, for the first time in memory, utterly fluent in it. The realization was a quiet, seismic shock to his system. He had spent a lifetime accumulating the currency of fame and victory, believing it to be the ultimate measure of a man. She had just revealed herself to be in possession of a far rarer, more valuable currency, the currency of grace. And it was this currency she had spent on him. For 20 years, she had made a continuous, silent withdrawal from her own integrity to protect a piece of his. She had paid for it with her silence, with the burden of a secret she carried alone, with the certain knowledge that he likely viewed her with a resentment she did not deserve. She had accepted that cost, that personal deficit, without any expectation of return. There was no market for this kind of transaction, no public exchange rate for this form of wealth. Its value was known only to the two people involved, and its worth was immeasurable. This was not the calculated contract-bound loyalty of the sports world or business. This was a raw, unguarded, and profoundly human act. It was a gift given in the dark, with no guarantee of light. This understanding dismantled the last of his defenses. The famous ego, the armor of achievement, the persona of invincibility. It all felt like a costume he had been wearing in an empty theater. The real victory, the enduring one, had been won off the court, in the quiet heart of a woman he had long since filed away as part of his past. She hadn't just kept a financial secret, she had kept his secret, the secret of the man he'd been before the world named him a king, the man who was afraid and wanted to build something real to hold on to. She had preserved that man when he himself had forgotten he existed. The emotion that rose in him then was not pride, not even gratitude anymore. It was a deep, abiding reverence. It was the humbling recognition that the most significant legacy he would ever be a part of was not broadcast on national television. It was a private trust, held in the heart of his ex-wife, and its dividends were just now, after 20 years, being paid out in the form of a staggering, life-altering perspective. The scoreboard of his life had been reset, and for the first time, he wasn't looking at points, he was looking at character, and he saw, with breathtaking clarity, that she had always been the richest person he knew. The words that formed in his mind were not the ones he expected. "I'm sorry," felt too small, too cheap a coin to offer in exchange for the fortune of loyalty she had just laid at his feet. It was an apology that couldn't be contained in a sentence. It had to be woven into the very fabric of his understanding, a fundamental reshaping of his memory of them. His silence on the line was no longer one of shock, but of a profound and grieving respect. He was sorry for the version of her he had carried in his head for 2 decades, a cardboard cutout of the ex-wife, a character in the story of his life whose only role was to eventually exit stage left. He had reduced a woman of immense depth and unshakable principle to a footnote, a financial settlement, a closed chapter. The arrogance of that now felt like a stain on his soul. He was sorry for every time he had dismissed her quiet strength as aloofness. He was sorry for every time he had mistaken her dignity for coldness. He was sorry for the years of distance he had interpreted as her creation, when in reality he had built the walls and then blamed her for not scaling them. The apology was a wave washing over every remembered slight, every moment of friction, every silent car ride filled with resentment. It cleansed them, not by erasing the past, but by revealing its true texture. Their arguments hadn't been about winning or losing. They had been the desperate, flailing attempts of 2 people drowning in the pressure of a life they had built together, but could no longer navigate as a team. The failure hadn't been a lack of love, it had been a surplus of pain, and a tragic lack of tools to express it in any way other than through conflict or silence. This apology, silent and seismic, was not a request for forgiveness. It was an act of seeing. For the first time since the divorce papers were signed, he was truly seeing her. Not the mother of his children, not his former spouse, but Juanita, the woman who had stood beside him when the world was at its most demanding, and who had, in the end, stood by a promise she made to him even when he was no longer standing beside her. He saw the immense loneliness of her position, the incredible strength it must have taken to hold that line against the very people she was paying to advise her. He saw the moral courage that was required to choose a forgotten promise over a guaranteed fortune. And in seeing her clearly, he was finally able to see himself clearly, reflected in the unwavering mirror of her character. The reflection was humbling. It was not always flattering, but it was the truth. And in that moment, the truth, however uncomfortable, felt more valuable than any of the trophies on his wall. This was the unspoken apology, the death of an old, selfish story, and the birth of a new, respectful understanding. It was the only thing he could give her that was equal to what she had given him. The silence stretched between them, a third presence on the call, filled not with awkwardness, but with a profound, shared understanding. Michael could feel the weight of the moment, the delicate fragility of the bridge she had built across 2 decades of silence with nothing but her integrity. He knew, with the same instinct that told him when to shoot and when to pass, that his next words would be among the most important of his life. They couldn't be about the money. They couldn't be a transactional thank you. They had to be something that matched the currency of her gesture. Something human. Something real. Something that acknowledged the staggering weight of what she had carried for him. He took a slow breath, the air feeling different in his lungs, as if he were breathing for the first time since she'd called. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, stripped bare of all its famous bravado. It was just a man's voice, rough with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "Juanita," he began, her name a soft acknowledgement of the person she was, not the role she had played in his story. "All these years, I thought I knew how that story ended." He paused, letting the admission hang in the air, a confession of his own blindness. "I was wrong. You—" His voice caught, and he didn't try to clear it. He let the crack remain, a testament to the emotion breaking through. "You didn't just keep that promise. You honored it. You honored me, at a time when I gave you every reason not to." The words were not dramatic. They were not a grand speech, but they were priceless in their raw, unfiltered honesty. They were the verbal equivalent of laying down his armor. He wasn't Michael Jordan, the icon, thanking a former associate. He was Michael, the man, humbled before a profound act of character that dwarfed any of his athletic achievements. "That account, the money, that's yours." The statement was simple, absolute. It was always yours from the moment you decided to protect it. "It's not mine to take back. It's yours to do with whatever you want. But what you really gave me, what you just gave me today." He struggled for the right words, for anything that could come close to quantifying the gift of a rewritten past. "That's worth more than anything I ever earned on a court. You gave me back a piece of myself I didn't even know was missing. You gave me back the belief that some things, some promises, are bigger than everything else." His response was priceless because it wasn't about the secret itself. It was about what the secret revealed. It was a recognition that her integrity had forever altered the scoreboard of their shared history. She hadn't just told him about a bank account. She had offered him a reflection of his younger self, a man who believed in promises, and in doing so, she had given the man he was today a chance to believe in them again. His response was the quiet, awestruck acceptance of that gift. It was the understanding that the most valuable things in life aren't won. They are entrusted to us by people of character. And in that moment, on that phone call, he received the richest inheritance of his life, not a sum of money, but the undeniable knowledge that his legacy was safe because it had been kept fiercely and faithfully in the heart of a woman who had every reason to let it go. The dial tone was a flat, dead hum in his ear, a stark contrast to the seismic shift that had just rearranged the very bedrock of his memory. For a long time, Michael Jordan did not move. The phone, sleek and black, and now utterly inert, remained, pressed against his face, as if he could still somehow channel the ghost of the conversation just past, to pull one more ounce of truth from its silence. Slowly, he lowered it, placing it back on its cradle with a deliberateness that felt ceremonial, like laying a cornerstone. The action seemed to finalize something, to seal the moment into history. He sat back in his leather chair, the familiar creak of it now sounding like the groan of a ship changing course. The study, his sanctuary of control and curated achievement, felt different. The air itself seemed thicker, charged with the particles of a rewritten past. His gaze traveled slowly around the room, taking inventory of a life lived in the blinding glare of the public eye. There was the framed jersey from the '92 finals, the fabric still vibrant, the number 23 a symbol known in every corner of the globe. There was the MVP trophy, its cool metal gleam catching the light, a testament to a season of utter dominance. Each object was a chapter in a story he thought he knew by heart, a story of relentless pursuit and undeniable victory. But now, as his eyes lingered on them, they seemed to morph before him. They were no longer just symbols of triumph. They were relics from a battle he'd been fighting on the wrong front. They represented a language of winning he had mastered, a language of points, stats, and accolades. But Juanita had just spoken a fluent, devastatingly beautiful dialect of a language he'd only ever fumbled with, the language of integrity. The money she had protected was meaningless. It was a number, a decimal point in the vast ledger of his wealth. Its value was laughable, but the act of protecting it? That was a treasure of an entirely different order. She hadn't just safeguarded funds. She had safeguarded a covenant. She had taken a vulnerable, whispered promise from a terrified young man at the height of his dizzying fame, and honored it with the ferocity of a knight guarding a crown jewel. She had done it through the bitterness of a very public unraveling, through the cold, clinical process of divorce, through 20 years of a life lived apart. She had done it alone. The sheer staggering weight of that solitude hit him then with the force of a physical blow. He had carried the weight of championships, of cities, of expectations, but he had never carried a silent, self-imposed burden like that. His burdens had always been shouldered in front of millions. His struggles, met with roaring approval or criticism. Hers had been shouldered in absolute silence, for no audience, for no reward other than the knowledge that it was the right thing to do. This was the new legacy she had handed him. It was not a thing to be displayed. It was a lens through which to review his entire existence. His old legacy was a monument, impressive and immovable, but static. It was a story that had ended. This new one was a living, breathing thing. It was the story of his character, and he saw now that it was a story he had not authored alone. For 20 years, a co-author had been quietly, faithfully writing a subplot of breathtaking loyalty, and he had been oblivious to it. The humility of that realization was a cleansing fire. It burned away the last vestiges of a selfish narrative, the story where he was the sole hero of his own saga. He was, he saw now, also a beneficiary of a grace he had done nothing to earn. This legacy demanded something of him. The old one was passive. People could look at it, admire it, debate it. This new one was active. It was a debt, not a financial debt. He knew with absolute certainty she would never accept a penny, and his insistence that the account was hers was the only honorable response, but a moral one. It was a debt paid forward not to her, but to the world. It was a mandate to live a life more worthy of the silent faith she had placed in him. It was a call to look beyond the scoreboard, to value the quiet, unseen acts of integrity over the noisy triumphs of ego. The trophies on the wall would never tarnish, but their meaning had been permanently altered. They were no longer the ultimate proof of his worth. They were simply what he had done, who he was. That measurement had just been taken by the one person whose opinion ever truly mattered. And he had been found both wanting and redeemed in the same breath. He thought of their children, of the legacy he hoped to leave them. It wasn't the highlight reels or the fortune. It was this lesson, learned 20 years too late, but delivered with such stunning clarity. It was the understanding that your name on a shoe, on a jersey, in a record book, is fleeting. But your name on someone's heart, as a person of unwavering principle and loyalty, that is eternal. That is the victory that outlasts all others. Juanita had given him back the man he was in 1991, scared, hopeful, and desperate to protect what was real. And in doing so, she had given the man he was today a priceless gift, a second chance to define what winning truly means. The final buzzer on his old life had sounded. The new game, the one that actually mattered, was just beginning. And for the first time, he wasn't concerned with being the greatest. He was concerned with being good.